If you've been watching this series since the beginning, you're gonna love this one because today we are finally gonna take the Ferrari off of the wooden dolly that has been sitting on since we put it there in February of last year. So let's do this. In the last episode, we finally finished installing all of our suspension components so that we can set the car down on its own weight for the very first time. We might not have wheels and tires yet, but we can still put jack stands underneath our spindles for the same proof of concept. Because this moment's been a long time in the making, I was eager to put the car out in the middle of the shop, to give myself some room to work around it and to see it from all angles. So my girlfriend Emily swung by and helped me make it happen. Now, if you haven't been watching since the beginning of this build, we put the car on this dolly so that we could remove all of the suspension components and so that we'd have a way to move it around the shop at least somewhat freely. It's been perched atop the dolly for 16 months, as there's been no easy way to get the dolly out from underneath, and there's been no need up until this point. But now I've got some fresh jack stands on hand, and even if only for a day or so, it's time to get this dolly removed. Before we do that, I did have to install the nuts for the upper ball joints on all 4 spindles. They finally arrived this morning and will allow us to actually load the car's suspension up without it falling apart. Everything else is only loosely bolted into place, but it should be just fine. Now I'll sheepishly say if you're enjoying this episode, I'd love it if you left a like or leave a comment. If you ask a question, I'll even make an effort to answer it if I can. And most importantly, if you want to see this car finished, subscribe, because it's only going to be a matter of time before we're counting down the episodes until this thing is actually done. For those curious, I'm positioning a jack stand underneath one tube of all 4 lower control arms. I don't have the turnbuckles on all 4 corners that represent our temporary coilovers matched in height, so it'll take some fine tuning to get this thing sitting level. But for now, it is officially off of the dolly, and it's time to get it out from underneath. Now, I wish I could say we'd never have to see this dolly again, but unfortunately, it'll make another appearance or 2 as we move the car around. In the long term, we'll build a better one, but we need to get this thing on the lift sooner than later. But for now, let's admire our hard work. Now let's cut to the chase. I know a lot of you guys are watching and wondering why this matters whatsoever. Why would I call this a major milestone in the build? I mean, after all, it's still sitting on supports of some kind. Why are jack stands better than a dolly? Well, the simplest answer is that for the first time, there's nothing holding up the car that isn't supposed to be there. Instead of holding the car up by the chassis, it is being supported by its own suspension. It might not be with a spring and shock, nor is it touching the ground with a wheel and tire, but those are just fine details. The reality is that at this point we can officially bolt wheels and tires onto the car and set it down. It can roll around without any issues, it can steer around the shop. I mean, this thing is truly closer than ever to being a complete car. That does have me wondering though. I want to weigh it again and see where we stand now. Although not a ton has changed since the last time we weighed it a few weeks ago, I'm curious to see what the differences add up to. We've got steering components in the front, as well as steering arms now front and rear. We've got our toe links at the back, including some pretty hefty mounts, as well as upper shock mounts and lower coilover mounts on all 4 control arms. On top of that, I forgot to weigh one of the brake rotors last time, and we've got a wing mounted at the back. So while there's still a lot of weight yet to go, this will give us a better idea of where we sit in reality. Not to mention the fact that we don't have to weigh the dolly this time. And the outcome is 1,958 pounds, including 24 pounds of jack stands. So let's talk about the numbers. At the moment, we're looking at 1,933 pounds of weight, not including the jack stands. Our cross weights are all out of whack, but that's because we've got solid suspension members and an uneven floor. Now, while the corner-to-corner and side-to-side weights can't be calculated, the front and rear, I would think, are relatively close. We're currently looking at a 4159 weight balance, with most of the weight still yet to go in, going back into the front of the car. I'm feeling really good about having a great weight balance in this thing, and a nice, low total weight. Now, the weight of the car is honestly looking really good. I'm quite surprised. I was expecting quite a bit over 2,000 pounds at this point because we've added a lot of weight to this thing in the last few weeks since we weighed it. Now, maybe the Dolly weighed more than I anticipated, or maybe we're just doing good on weight management, but either way, I'm happy. That's 1,933 pounds if we ignore the jack stands. That means about 2,133 once we have wheels and tires on it, but there's still a lot of other stuff too. We've got the rest of the aero package to install, quite a bit of interior stuff, just lots of miscellaneous things and knickknacks. It's gonna add up, so we're gonna keep our fingers crossed for 2,500 pounds as that finished weight, and maybe lower if we're lucky. Now let's talk about Swaybars, because that's on the list, and it's something that we need to start planning on and knocking out, and you guys were asking about it in the last episode, so let's dive into the car. Let's come here into this wheel well here up front. And first things first, I'm going to address this. I saw all of your comments in the last episode that you don't like how long this lever is. I did address this in a previous episode. It's going to get another support, but I'm addressing it again just to ease anybody that's worried. This is not the final solution. This is just assembled. Now let's talk about this sway bar. As you can see, it runs through the front of the car to each side, and honestly, it's relatively close to working if we wanted to run it. We could change the sway bar end link on this thing and add a mount to our control arm, and it would work. It's relatively close in shape, but the spring rate's going to be wrong, and honestly, I think our wheel would hit it. It's not quite the right shape. So what we're going to do is we're going to replace this with what's called a splined sway bar. Now, luckily for demonstration's sake, I happen to have a splined sway bar here in the shop. This is one that I bought for the Rusty E28 project some 8 years ago. Now, it's not going to work for our project, but it's a perfect example of what we're looking for. The sway bar gets its name from the splines at each end of the sway bar itself, and the purpose of the splines is to allow the attachment of custom arms for custom applications. You can think of a sway bar like this as a universal application meant for more or less pretty much any race car. The arms at each end are made from steel and are custom shaped for every application. And last but not least, for mounting purposes, there are typically bearings within housings that can be bolted to the chassis. For the Ferrari, we will order a sway bar to a custom length and then make our own arms to attach to it. We'll mount those arms to the control arms and call it done. Now we're going to make that splined sway bar work by mounting it in the exact same position this one is. The splined tube will pass through the front, and we will mount it just like this one is using this surface here. The splines will terminate about this width, and then we will have an arm that mimics the shape of the lower control arm and comes over and terminates about here. Relatively similar to the factory sway bar, but we need more clearance in this area here. Our front tire would hit this when we turn, and we don't want that. But by kind of bending this further back and then over, we'll terminate it in loosely the same area. We'll add a sway bar end link out here so we have a lot of leverage on our sway bar. We'll give ourselves a lot of adjustability, and we have to make sure that we clear all of our steering components under our travel, and we got to make sure we clear our wheel and tire package. But overall, that is the plan, and we're going to get started on it. Now, the story and solution are relatively similar here in the back of the car. The original sway bar was mounted here and passed across the back as the lowest point of the back of the car. And due to spatial constraints, we're going to have the same thing here. We're going to mount it to this location, pass a blade forward, and then mount it to our lower control arm. Now, this bar back here will have to be quite a bit stiffer because we're going to mount so far inboard on our control arm, we're not going to have much leverage, but that should be okay. We'll just put a stiff bar back here. Now, while we're at the back of the car, we need to talk about axles. I wish I could say this was an axle for the car, but instead, it's just a factory Honda axle that I was using back at the beginning of the build for mock-up purposes. We're going to need some special axles. One's ordered to a custom length with a Honda inner and a Corvette outer. It'll look relatively similar to the factory Honda axle, but the splines on the Corvette hubs are significantly bigger. We'll also need to make sure we order axles that can withstand the power this thing's going to put to the ground. In all, these axles shouldn't be a tall order. They'll easily connect to the transmission, but when it comes to actually attaching them to the hub, we're going to have to make some changes. If we look at the backside of the spindle, you'll notice that there's no pass-through for an axle, so we're going to have to start by cutting one in the back of it. If we cut a hole, the axle should be able to pass through and can then be bolted to the hub itself, but there may be some spatial constraints that'll be a challenge for an axle building engineer. But I don't think it'll be a problem we can't overcome. So our big ticket items in order to finish this car up are those axles, we need sway bars, we need wheels and tires, and then we've got to put all the aero on. And there's a lot of knickknacks in there otherwise, some interior stuff. and all that kind of stuff. We got to finish that hood vent, put fans on, etc., etc. Don't get me wrong, there's a long way to go, but I feel like for the very first time, I can see the finish line with my own eyes. I feel like we are truly, for the first time, actually getting close to having a finished car. Now, I am worried that those axles are going to be what really hold us up. I have heard from others that there can be huge lead times on parts like that right now. Hopefully in the next few days, I'll get this thing all measured up. We'll make our modifications to the spindles and we'll find out what we need and then how long it's actually gonna take, because we can't drive nor tune this thing until we have axles in it. The aero, we don't have to get done. It doesn't need it in order to drive it, but here in the next couple of weeks, I wanna get the car up on the lift and get underneath it for the first time. There's gonna be some stuff we need to finish underneath, quite a bit of welding, and we need to be under it so that we can mount the splitter, the flat bottom floor, and the side splitters. I'm excited to see underneath it for the first time. It's been on the Dolly. I don't know what this thing looks like underneath, so that'll be pretty cool. That's definitely on the to-do list. Overall, we're really getting close. I know that there's a lot of stuff left to do. I really do. But, like I said, we are really getting close to having what could be considered in some fashion a complete car. And I'm excited about it. I'm at an all-time high right now. With that said, this episode's over. I'm just gonna keep rambling otherwise. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you didn't, too bad. Don't know what to tell you. But I'll catch you guys on Friday for the next one. We'll see what we get into. Thank you as always for the support. I'll see you then.